Welcome to the EntreEd Talk podcast. We are your hosts, Toi Hirschman and
Laura McCall.
Join us as we dive into incredible stories from inspiring entrepreneurs around the world.
Whether you are an educator looking for ideas to engage students, a new learner, or someone who wants to be inspired, our guest journeys and their ideas will give you resources to create value and take your own lead into entrepreneurship.
We are so looking forward to sharing our message with you.
And don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe to the EntreEd Talk podcast on whatever platform you listen.
Hi, and welcome to EntreEd Talk. Today, my co-host Toi and myself, Laura, are very excited to talk to Mark Hines. Dr. Mark Hines is the director of Kupu Academy, KHA, which develops and implements programs for teachers and learners with a focus on deeper learning practices. KHA is a part of Mid-Pacific Institute, a pre-K through 12 independent school, and none other than Honolulu, Hawaii. I wish you could see where Mark's sitting right now. KHA focuses on progressive and research-based instructional, assessment, and leadership practices, including PBL, inquiry, and deep learning. Mark was the director of Mid-Pacific Exploratory, MPX, and the Academy Technology Chair at Mid-Pacific Institute. MPX is a grade 9 and 10 program that focuses on integrated community project-based learning. Students build authentic projects and work on community issues while integrating math, science, technology, language arts, social studies, and the arts. In all, he has taught science, math, and been involved with technology planning for 38 years. He is passionate about teaching, learning, and the future of education. He served on the governing board of the school for the examining essential questions of sustainability and is past president of the Hawaii Society for Technology and Education. He has also coached high school canoe paddling for 32 years and is a committed Boy Scout assistant scoutmaster with Troop 10 in Honolulu. Mark consults and presents locally and nationally on issues of deeper learning in schools, technology and education, and school transformation. He is a recipient of the Presidential Award for Math and Science Teaching, a National Tandy Technology Scholar, and a Pacific Technology Foundation Technology Educator of the Year. In 2006, he was recognized by the Hawaii Association of Independent Schools as an educator for the future. He serves as a planning member of the statewide Schools of the Future Conference, as well as the leading schools of the Future Conference. He has a PhD in educational technology from the University of Hawaii and a BS in physics from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. My goodness, Mark, welcome. We're so excited to talk to you, and what an incredible background you have.
Aloha, good morning. Good morning for me, anyhow. Good afternoon for you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and wherever our listeners are, hello. Wow, I'm just so impressed. And we've been chatting a little bit before our podcast. Mark's a lot of fun to talk to. We had to stop him so our listeners will hear all the great stuff as well. Mark, there's so much to chat about, and Toi and I very much want to hear about it all. You're a multi-award-winning teacher and leader in technology and STEM and guide Hawaii in multiple initiatives in pre-K. But before we dive into all the specifics, tell us about your journey in getting to Hawaii and in your entrepreneurship career.
Sure. It's wonderful to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share. The first thing I just want to say is it strikes me that all of us are the product of the relationships in the community we live within. And I think of all of the work that I've been blessed to have been involved with is an outgrowth from my parents at an early age to the community that I work with here in Hawaii now, and just find so dear and near to keeping my passions kindled. I went to Rensselaer with a degree in physics because as a high school student, I was a musician and a science nerd. And I was debating whether to go into music or science. And when I looked at the opportunities to get jobs in music, I thought, boy, I should get a degree in science. So I went and I had a passion for physics and got a degree in physics. But almost right out of college, this was 1982, and there was nothing like today, but there was an economic downturn, and so jobs were not as as common. And so I, during the summer, did not get a job right out of college, which turned out to be an incredible, fortunate opportunity, because as I was sitting around a table with a family friend, he looked at me and he said, "Mark, I think you would have made a marvelous teacher." And I went to an engineering school. No one talked about education because engineering was the focus. Like, we're all going to be engineers. And I was like, "Oh, Dick, I'm not going to be, I'm a scientist. I'm not going to be a teacher." And he said, "Oh, it's a shame. You really should be a teacher. You know what? You don't have a job right now. My brother is the superintendent in the town next door. You can be a substitute teacher. You can make some money while you're looking, to go to graduate school or get a job." And I said, "Okay, money sounds good. I'll get money." And within the first 3 days of being in the classroom, I realized I had been looking down the wrong road. The minute I walked in and started working with kids, it brought something out of me that I didn't know I had, and a passion in working with kids. And so that was just a chance encounter. There's no reason I should have ended up in education in the first place. It was literally through Dick Smith, a dear friend of, or parent of a friend of mine. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my mother and saying, "Ma, there's a problem. I think I'm supposed to be a teacher, but there's no job for teachers." Literally everyone was being, a lot like what we're going to see now this year, where education budgets are being cut, teachers are being let go. And so there were no jobs for teachers. And she looked at me and she said, "Mark, I just want you to remember, if you're good at what you do, someone will always want to work with you." And so she gave me permission to look into education. I've fortunately found a job position because I was a science teacher, which there weren't a lot of, with a degree in science. And so I was able to get a job at the age of 22 as a teacher, when the next youngest teacher in the school I was in, Hanover High School on the mainland in Massachusetts, was 42 years old. And so they all looked at me as sort of their little son. They put me under their wing. And after working there for a couple of years, I decided to move out to Hawaii to chase my girlfriend out there. A perfect reason to move across the world. And what was sad was these educators, who were wonderful people, came up to me and they said, "Mark, you're a smart guy. You're leaving here. You're going to go to Hawaii. Don't go back into education. You'll regret this." It was such a disenfranchisement at that point because of what was happening in education. And so they tried to guide me out of education, which was, so when I first came to Hawaii, I didn't look for education jobs. And then I kept thinking, geez, I don't think I'm done with this. So I fortunately found a job at Mid-Pacific Institute. They hired me. But it stuck with me that these colleagues that I valued their opinion, because they thought they were being kind to me, said, "You don't want to be this. You'll get stuck in this career and then you'll wish you had done something else." So I'm glad that fortune shined my way, and I still found a way to end up in education, because it seemed like there were things that weren't moving me there. And I've been at Mid-Pacific now for 35 years and have loved every minute of being an educator and the opportunities it's afforded me to work with colleagues who are passionate and care deeply about the future and the citizenship and the growth of adolescence. And the relationships that I've made with them and the students I've worked with. So I started as a math and science teacher, and then when I was finally reaching a point that I was going to get out of steps, and one of my mentor colleagues said to me, "Mark, if you're going to get a master's degree, don't get it in education, because you already know how to teach. You don't need a master's in ed. Go find something that's interesting to you." And I was really interested in the role technology at that point. This is in the early 1990s, was playing in helping shape the way that we could deepen and expand opportunities for kids to learn, to do hands-on work, to actually work with virtual objects. And I was fascinated with the role technology had. So I went to the University of Hawaii. They have a wonderful department in educational technology, and I got my master's there, and then ended up going back and getting my doctorate there another couple of decades later. A little too late than I should have, but that led to me actually switching roles at the school and becoming the technology director in the late 90s, as we reimagined what technology would look like. Not, at that point, everyone was thinking technology was teaching kids how to use computers. And the International Society for Technology in Education, ISTE, really led a movement about rethinking what technology meant in education, and about it being supporting learning in a way in which, it was about, some of the same things we're talking about today with project-based learning and 21st century skills, about communication and critical thinking and students problem solving and coding, and, sort of rethinking the work around the computer being a means by which education could be more vastly expanded to do much more in terms of differentiation and online learning and all of that. So I led that effort at our school for over a decade. And then another strange opportunity came up where there was a technology grant that was being offered in the islands. This was called Black Foundation in Hawaii. And there was an opportunity to rethink what the grant was doing, because they were worried that they were spending a lot of money giving schools grants for computers and for networking and for wireless, but they weren't sure that they were getting any return on the investment. What were people doing with this? And I was in a meeting with about 10 other educators with a group of Hawaii Independent School heads. And I shot off my mouth a little and I said, the problem is that the technology isn't changing the professional learning of teachers. We really need to think about a way that we're changing the way schools and teachers think about teaching and learning. And then the technology comes in, not the other way around. You don't put computers in and then hope it's going to change education. And that was sort of the consensus of the group. So that got retooled into a grant called Schools of the Future. And that grant, which had 20 schools, and my school, Mid-Pacific, was one of them, was a transformation grant. It wasn't a technology grant, although money could be spent on technology. So that changed my role again, both at our school and the way I worked with different schools in the state, because we started asking the question, if you're going to use technology or if you're going to do professional learning, to what end? And so that led to a statewide conference that we have been running now for 11 years, called Schools of the Future, where over 2,000 educators come together and we learn from each other about the ways that we're not just using technology, but we're addressing social emotional learning, that we're looking at ways to do deeper learning practices, inquiry and PBL and design thinking, that we're looking at ways that we can build community and do things that are more supporting the ways that we look at assessment practices. I just was in a committee meeting this week. We were reading the proposals and making decisions. This year, the conference needs to be held virtually because we don't know what will be possible come October, which is usually when we run the conference. So we retooled the conference to really ask the question, what have we learned in the process of this latest crisis in education, where many schools had to work remotely, and actually all schools had to work remotely, and had to figure out how to help teachers and students and families learn in a distance learning environment. So that's another technology question, but it really centered more about pedagogy and assessment, and it created its own challenges. So there's been this journey that's sort of been following, as I mentioned at the beginning. I don't think I ever intended to be where I am today. I've been blessed that I've been supported and worked with a community that we've risen together and agreed on the things that we think are the important aspects of what school and learning mean and how to make them more meaningful. And that work continues today through the work we're doing with Kupu Academy. So that sounded like a meandering view, but that's actually the way my life feels at times, as I've been sometimes carried by the winds and sometimes picked my course, depending upon what happens.
Isn't that the way you're supposed to be?
I wouldn't argue it for any other way, given that's where it's taken me. But I think everyone's got to do that for themselves.
Oh my gosh, Mark, that's so incredible. And we always talk to you amazing folks in Hawaii and go, oh, yeah, how do I get my kid on a plane every day? I don't know how to get my kid.
Toi and I are planning to present at your conference, hopefully in person next year, right, Toi?
And I will say, so this is my little pitch for the Schools of the Future conference. If you just Google Schools of the Future conference, because it's virtual this year, it is possible for anyone. We're actually working with a partnership. We do some work with schools in China as well now. And so we're actually even having Chinese teachers come and learn what are best practice ideas for deeper learning work, design thinking work, how to help them even with their changing of their thinking about what teaching and learning look like. But for anyone that listens to your podcast, it's possible to be part of the conference now because it's all virtual. And we have an incredible group of teachers and leaders that are going to be sharing their best practice ideas and ways to take that away into your own learning and professional work as an educator and as a leader. So yes, go for it.
But it would be fun to actually be in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's too. Yep. No doubt.
Hey, Mark, this is so cool. You mentioned a couple of buzzwords a few times, and I wanna pick them apart a little bit. So
sure.
Some of the key elements in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education are design-based thinking and student inquiry and reflection. And you mentioned also deeper learning. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what that looks like for students in your classrooms and how you maybe take us through a day in the life. What is deeper learning for a 10th grader or something like that? What's that look like?
It's a really great question. And for us, we have a program that we started, which was meant to be our own little skunk works, I think is what we thought of it back. We were big lovers of Clay Christensen's book about the transforming education back from 12 years ago in the research he had done about and Michael Horn on changing education. And the idea that change happens when there's an opportunity for a small group to experiment and then everyone can learn from that. And so we called that initiative Mid-Pacific Exploratory, which was a 9th and 10th grade program that students could choose, because at that time it was still a lot of people had reservations about, this was in 2010, which sounds like just yesterday, but the shift in the conversation here in the state and nationwide about this work is pretty remarkable. But in 2010, when you told someone, well, you can take traditional classes, math, science, all of them separate, all of them more traditionally assessed, tests and books, curriculum, or you can take a course that's integrated math, science, technology, language arts, social studies with arts embedded in it. And you would spend your time with less teachers going more deep into authentic work. And so we had some entrepreneurial students. There were 17 in our inaugural class back in 2011 when we launched this. They're all graduated from college. Now they all turned out fine. There were some people that thought these kids will never be able to learn. You're just going to let them have fun and solve problems. Like, that's not schooling. And so our tenets about what we wanted to do, one of my dear colleagues, Greg Kaneko, who teaches with me, actually said at one point, if we do no harm, then we'll have done our job. Because it was interesting. I was listening to one of your podcasts with Jeff Remington I mentioned earlier, and he mentioned something about, by the time kids come to high school, they've lost their openness to divergent thinking. They've lost their passion. Like, they're now just following the rules so they can get done with high school so they can move on. And at Mid-Pacific and at many schools now around the country here in Hawaii, that I work closely with, we're really rethinking and rebuilding our institution so that it's not a thing to get done. It's a place to come because you want to come, because it's shaped for you. And so that was our work with Mid-Pacific Exploratory. So our tenets were around the design work that the Hewlett Foundation articulated about a decade ago about deeper learning competencies, about rigorous, interesting content that students grapple with, about critical thinking and problem solving, heavy amounts of collaboration and communication required, development of mindset through the work of having agency and control over your learning and voice and choice. And so we spent a lot of time as faculty designing learning experiences that were inherently interesting, that were driven by a significant essential question. So some of those for us over the years have been, in what ways is water an indicator of power in society? Because where the water is clean and available, it's different depending upon what community you live in and what society you live in, how that can be used for power. So that's been a driving question for us the last couple of years. In Hawaii, not surprising, we're in the middle of the Pacific. So if water for us goes away, we can't bring it in from some other place. So managing water, the Hawaiian culture and the way that they manage land and water assets long before Western contact, before it was discovered, which it was not. It was discovered by the Polynesians 1,000 years ago. But the land management system is something to learn from. So our students would dive deep into what were the past ways that Hawaiians and Polynesians manage water and assets. What are ways we're doing it now? How do we know water is clean? Who makes the decisions around that? How do we as a society decide who gets water rights? It's been a big issue here in the islands with agriculture and fishing and water and then commercial uses. So who controls the water? Well, that's a driving question that's inherently interesting and lets you go into many different ways in which students can say, I think we should really focus on this problem. And then what's the challenge for teachers and the thing that we help them with when we look at how do you do this professionally is we start with that essential question that helps us drive the learning. And then we go back and look at the standards that we know we have to address. I teach 10th grade science, so that's NGSS 2, so I know what that has to have. I teach the mathematics that's under that with Algebra 2, so I know what has to be embedded in there. The social studies teacher knows those things. And so we go back and we map into those the standards that fit as the students find their learning journey through. So we're not standards driven, we're standards aware in the way that we treat that. So we still have students do wonderfully well on standardized tests and move on and take, interesting pathways through the rest of their schooling experience into post-secondary work. But the learning that they're doing is driven by something that's inherently interesting. And that was, for us, what the deeper learning practices that we wanted to center our work on were critical to do. But that was a long answer for a short question. Sorry about that.
Again, as Toi's saying, some of these things struck us. I'm listening to this, Mark, and I'm fascinated by the whole mapping process, asking the question first, then going back and look at your standards. Because I think in traditional education, we so often get stuck on what are the standards, and we're already bored with looking at the standards, and then we figure out how do we fit it in. And you've made it a more exciting way. You're still hitting all the marks, obviously, but that's truly the entrepreneurial spirit of let's throw something out there, and then let's back up and figure out the ways that we're going to deal with it. In all of that, and as you're asking these questions, I'm curious, what are some of the standout projects, innovations in your project-based learning that you can think of through the years since you started in 2011 that students have come up with? Any wow factors or,
It's a wonderful question. And I want to, before I jump into that, you asked a question about entrepreneurship. And I know that's a focus for this podcast and what you're talking about. I think the strongest thing that we see about entrepreneurship in the work we do with Kupu Academy is giving teachers permission to be educational entrepreneurs in their classroom. What we have a lot in education is this compliance mentality of teachers can't innovate because they've been handed a curriculum or a set of guidelines about the way they're supposed to teach. And as we work with leaders, we're finding that they're giving teachers more permission. In Hawaii, the superintendent, Christina Kishimoto, has given schools much more autonomy to make decisions about how and what not the standards necessarily, but the means by which they get to those, and has given a wider berth of opportunity. And so that's empowered schools to start really focusing on being entrepreneurs in their community. So instead of thinking of, we statewide do this curriculum, instead, schools are saying, boy, isn't it interesting? We live in Waipahu, and there's these interesting needs in our community. How might we address these needs through the learning we need our students to do that have an impact in our community? And in Hawaii, there's communities spread out amongst all of the islands that are here, and they all have inherent needs and interesting places and community resources that can be leveraged as a part of learning for students. So that's one thing. So to that end, I'd like to just champion a couple of projects. This just came up this week. I was talking to my good friend Aaron, who teaches on the Big Island, the island of Hawaii, at an independent school. And he started a capstone project that is now part of this is Hawaii Preparatory Academy on the Big Island. All of their seniors, as a part of their senior year, have to do a capstone. This was something that Aaron started to develop with one of his co-teaching colleagues at one of our academies that we ran about 3 years ago. And now their school has adopted this wonderful expectation that every senior will develop a project that's centered on a question of that they want to address. So it might be, how might we turn growing systems into a way of doing art? Or how might I take my passion of surfing into new design and engineering ideas in surfboards? Or what kinds of stance might I take about a cultural position that I think needs to be addressed? So some students actually were part of a voyaging canoe that allowed them to, it's called makali'i, and they actually learned how to voyage in a Polynesian canoe, and all of the art and the science and the knowledge that's built into the indigenous ways of knowing how to navigate the seas and how to manage food and resources on an ocean voyage. So that's one example of how Aaron became an entrepreneur and drove a kind of learning at his school. One of my dear colleagues, Cece Chung, who's actually Hawaii State Teacher of the Year, this past year at an elementary school, Kaimiloa, her and her co-teaching colleague were reading a book about migrant workers. And the students were really interested in, like, wait, so these teenage kids pick food that I eat. How can we make a difference? And so they designed a project working, again, with some of the strategies that we gave them in Kupu Academy and some that they knew through their own instincts, to connect to their community and build sustainable gardens on their campus, because the students said, if we can do something to grow sustainable gardens, and these are like 3rd, 4th, 5th graders, then we can make a difference, because someone won't have to pick grapes for me in California because maybe I can grow them here. So it wasn't just about the gardening part. It was the social stance and the awareness of their role and having empathy for other kids around the world that maybe aren't as fortunate as them in a way they could make a difference. And that's a public school. At a charter school in Hawaii, Halau Kumana, one of our Kupu colleagues, Phil Galisi now, really became interested in the cultural strand around native birds. In Hawaii, if you look at the ali'i, the royalty, they had these enormously beautiful feather capes that were managed through really tight resource management in the islands before Western contact. And almost all those indigenous birds are gone now because there was a depletion of resources when Hawaii changed into a 21st century economy. So his students became really interested in how might we curate and cultivate an awareness of how important these birds are, and the ones that are left, how might we help? And so their exploration took them through working with naturalists over some of the reserve areas on the island. It helped them tell the stories, and they made kahili, which are these beautiful feathered monuments that allow people to identify with a particular area or kuleana where they're from. And so that project became for the students a passionate experience about how. But if you looked at the standards that Phil met through it, he met cultural standards, science standards, writing standards. They were all embedded in the project. If you had asked the kids in any of this work, what standards are you doing today? They might say, I don't know. But what I am doing is I'm making a difference with my work. And so the artful work of doing deeper learning work, and when teachers feel like they're entrepreneurs and they can design based on what they have in their community and the expertise that they know they can bring, and why they went into education in the first place, giving them permission to design based on what they know their kids will be interested in, and not having someone tell them, oh, it's Tuesday, you have to teach quadratic functions, or it's Wednesday, we're doing persuasive essays today. Instead, letting teachers do that work and honoring them as professionals to design that learning. That's the entrepreneurship part that's led to amazing project work that we've seen across the state through teachers working closely with their kids and their parents and their community to build learning experiences that are transformative for learners and for teachers. One of my favorite lines, and then I'll shut up, which is hard for me, as you can tell already, is one of the teachers that we worked with said, before I came to Kupu Academy, I thought I was done teaching. I was just burned out. I've been teaching for, I can't remember how long it was, 25, 30 years. And he said, boy, after doing this and seeing what happened when I transformed my classroom, I've got another 30 years in me. Wow. Because there's so much joy and laughter and and passion. Another teacher relayed a story that he had a problem because they had at his school issues with kids coming to school. They had serious issues with kids just not showing up. And then when he started doing project work, he had to send kids home because they were lying to their parents when they were sick, saying, no, I'm fine. I got to go to school because I got to work on my project. And so the problem was now no longer that the kids wouldn't want to come to school. The problem was they shouldn't come to school sometimes because they knew being there mattered. Their presence on campus had a purpose. So those are things that, we see as the kind of projects that are indicators that there's something really significant happening in the classrooms.
Wow. I love that. That's so true and important. And I also hate quadratic function Tuesdays. That's not my favorite day.
I'd love to show you the math project I designed around that, which was just so wonderful. And we did quadratics, and I know some math teachers looked and said, "Oh, you can't teach quadratics that way." And all the kids went on and took calculus after. They never thought to themselves, "Oh, I was shorted out of learning it the right way."
No, please share that with me. If you don't, I will bug you until you do, because I have a couple of teachers that have asked for ideas in that. I have one with quadratics, but I'd love to see what you do with it. But one of the things that I guess maybe it's a toyism, but I like to call a lot of times when we go into schools, what we do is trickle down empowerment. So, we see this all the time where when you empower teachers, which is what you're saying, and your superintendent has done as well, to be more entrepreneurial and innovative, it's just natural that the kids are going to be that way. And I love that you talk about the way your students learn as a learning journey. And my favorite thing was you said standards aware. And I like that because that's so important. We all have to kind of work with these standards, but the fact that you're able to do it in a kind of a sneaky way where kids, they're not realizing I just did, algebra standard A 1.3 or whatever it is. Yeah. But I learned this thing, and I looked on the MPX website, and something that struck me as really interesting was that the 10th graders can choose or not choose to take Algebra 2 because, like you said before, it's embedded in the science. And I think that is such a cool thing, but probably blows a lot of people's minds.
Yeah. I want to say something about standards that sort of I tell teachers now, because, we complain about standards in a way that's probably because of the way that it's being assessed, right? So like if, the problem with schools is if we expect teachers to assess differently, but somehow we're still expecting, classrooms to be assessed with a standardized instrument, then we have a problem. And I don't disagree with the notion of kids and teachers should be accountable for learning. The question is by what means. But when I talk about standards, I say, if you think about it, every standard, someone thought this was important. And the question I ask myself is why? So in other words, it isn't like, I got to teach quadratic equations. The question I ask when I design a lesson is, why is the quadratic equation to someone? So I think about a mathematician or an engineer, and I think, are they using it? And if so, how? So if they're using it, they're thinking about a trajectory maybe, or they're thinking of it as looking at some data that came out of a curve that they're trying to nuance out, like what the trend is. And so when I'm designing learning within a project, my mission is, how would a mathematician or an engineer or an author or an artist use this knowledge and have the kids use it in an authentic way? Because then the standard isn't something I have to address right now. It's like, well, that's something that, an engineer would use in the process of looking at circular motion. And if I'm working with bicycles, there's a lot of circular motion. So it's embedded in there. We just have to nuance it out when the kids look at it. So I've sort of learned to live with standards in a way in which I don't think about how someone hands me standards, but instead I ask, why is this a standard at all? Why did someone think this was important for kids to learn? And then trying to figure out where that exists in the real world, and then making that where the learning is situated, instead of, I'm going to teach it to you, and then someday you might use it, which is the death knell of interest to anyone in a classroom, right?
I hear that way too often sometimes. Talk about I'm sorry, Laura, but I just wanted to follow because it goes along with what you just said. But can you talk a little bit about assessment and how?
Do we have 3 hours?
tests, because I know you have to assign grades at some point.
Yeah.
How do you do that with these amazing experiential projects?
I am so glad you asked that question because I love to talk about assessment. As a campus, we have sat down, Mid-Pacific is 1,500 students, my school, pre-K-12. So I do have to sort of paint this real quick for you. So pre-K is Reggio Emilia, if you're not familiar with, as a pedagogical approach, an amazing student-centered, students ask questions, they explore, they're given provocations. It's an incredible brain-based way for learning. Our elementary is inquiry-driven, and so it's driven by student questions with Reggio influence. And then our middle and high school are evolving with design thinking and project-based learning and just general deeper learning practices. In all of those pedagogical approaches to learning, we ask the question about assessment because the word assess is from the French word assesser, which means to sit beside. And so as a campus and in all of the workshops and the teachers that we work with, we talk a lot about assessment means to sit beside, which means it's in the service for learning, not of learning. So in other words, we are working with students as a means to support learning, and assessment supports learning. It isn't putting a cow on a scale. It's gauging, how they're eating in the field. What does the feed look like? Am I looking at the weather? I mean, the things that we do in assessment, in the end, the students will be fine if we use the process as a means to intentionally and regularly give kids meaningful opportunities to exhibit what they know and to give them feedback and critiquing. So that's what we call formative assessment. And I will say, I want to give credit to Ann Davies and Sandra Herbst, who are part of Connected for Learning, which is an organization out of Canada and have worked around the world with assessment practice. We've worked closely with them for years and years, and that's their primary focus. They're really a wonderful organization. And so a lot of the language of our talk as a campus about assessment has come from us looking deeply at assessment as a means in service for learning. And so that notion of when I'm in a classroom, by what means am I collecting evidence that students are moving on a learning journey that I can measure? So that means I might see artifacts being created. I might see things being written. I might see things being constructed. I might see collaborative work in which there's some evidence that comes out of that that's an artifact. I might have opportunities to observe, so I can see students applying a formula or practicing a skill or working on multiple versions of giving feedback and showing what they know by adding to a conversation. And then I will have conversations and observe conversations between students. So when we talk about assessment, we talk about triangulation by what are the means by which I'm collecting evidence that give me a high degree of reliability that I understand what a student learns. So in MPX, which we've been doing now for 10 years, we give almost no standard tests. If we give tests at all, they're usually formative, meaning there are means by which students can get a sense of how they're doing. But the things that we use to assess are a wide range of evidence, observations, and conversations that we have with students that we track closely to gauge their performance. Here's the thing that I want to drive into with that. By doing that, we give students much more opportunities to show what they know through a variety of means. So a kid that might be good on testing, and I was one of those kids, I got through school with almost no studying because I could take tests. And then I hit college and was like, oh, I'm in trouble, because now I haven't really learned how to learn because I never got a chance to really get feedback. Well, we want to have students always be challenged with the question of, today was a day that you did work. By what means will you show me that this time was well spent? What evidence have you provided? And so there's just, when we do our workshops, we spend a good amount of time with teachers talking about what are the means that you're collecting data. And by the way, even in this virtual age, those means still exist. We have lots of ways virtually that we can collect evidence that go beyond just, one of the things that COVID presents is this opportunity to say, well, it's hard to give kids a test if they're at home. So then how are we assessing learning? Well, if you're a PBL teacher, if you're a deeper learning teacher, you've already got this whole tool belt full of assessment practices that lend themselves to collect evidence of student learning that go well beyond just what a test would do. And I don't mean to say tests are bad necessarily.
I'll say it.
I'll try not to say it too much. Because we're collegial, but I certainly think that there are means that I think provide deeper and more personalized and more differentiated ways for any kind of learner to show what they know. Does that help answer that assessment question?
Yes, you did. Then that was awesome. I'm totally on board. The more I hear you talk, and the more connections are firing in my brain about all the things of what your classroom and what your school does. I think going back a little bit, it strikes me, we talk as entrepreneurs about start with an interest, right? And so you've given the kids a question with a PBL, start with an interest, and then that interest becomes a passion. And what I find phenomenal is that you've embedded some career paths that they don't even know about, by the physics question, by the ecosystem question, and maybe they're following that into a higher learning situation without even knowing, that they were going to love it. So yeah, phenomenal.
I'd love to tell you a story of one student. There was this young lady, Elena, who came to our school in 10th grade, and she was part of our class and fell in love with the social justice work that we did as a part of our curriculum, where the students were working with community partners. We looked at homelessness that year, which is an issue in Hawaii, as it is in many places in the country. And she also had she was part Native American Indian, not Hawaiian, but from the mainland, and so had a passion for indigenous beliefs and systems. And so she ended up going to Yale, and she became passionate about indigenous rights, but also about science. And so the last time I talked to her, she had spent the summer working with a researcher going through the America Southwest, sort of cataloging both Native people, but also looking at the flora and fauna that were associated with that. And just, became really focused about this. And she credited the work of doing, when she had the opportunity to learn because she was interested in it, is what drove her to find things that drove her to her passions. And we find that over and over again with our students. One other student I'll just mention, his name is Nathaniel. This was in the very first year of our program. One of our 17 entrepreneurs, we called them educational entrepreneurs, they took a chance on this program that was new, and everyone said, oh, just go with the regular way. Why would you want to do something new? And I remember him as a 9th grader saying to me, Hines, if you just let me learn whatever I wanted to learn when I want, I'd get to more of your content standards than even you have in mind. And I was a project-based teacher, and he was telling me this. Well, I just heard from him the other day. He's finishing his PhD in physics at the university. And, his passion was around science and exploring things. And so he's moved on and is finishing his doctoral work in physics. And I couldn't be prouder of him, because he knew at the age of 14, if you just let me learn what I want to learn, I'll be fine. Like, you don't have to tell me to do everything. And I think that's, back a little while ago, we talked about divergent thinking and giving students choice. It's in pulling away from us telling kids what to do all the time, and projects and inquiry and design thinking, all those pedagogies around deeper learning, give students the ability to be in charge, to pull their own triggers, to be agents of their learning. And that has downwind implications for them as citizens, as learners, as empathetic members of their community, because they're in charge.
And you follow what we read in studies, is that he was probably like that in kindergarten. And if he'd gone through traditional education, that would have all been squelched by high school. And then it gets to someplace like your academy and the world opens up. It's amazing. Hey, tell us briefly about the technology you guys are looking at with regard to leading Schools of the Future Summit. Tell me a little bit about that focus.
So it's interesting. We started the Schools of the Future conference in 2010, I think, 2011. And it was for teachers. And so, the first year we had 300, then it was 500, then it was 800, then it was 1,000, then it was 50, it grew every year. And somewhere 5-6 years ago, we realized we're leaving the leaders out of this conversation. schools are sending teachers to this conference and they're learning, and then they're going back into schools that the structures are still the same. And so they're having a challenge. And so we started a one-day summit called Leading Schools of the Future, which was for school leaders. And last year we worked with about 130 school leaders in the state of Hawaii. And we walked them through a day of how do you intentionally work in equity environments so that every student and every classroom provides opportunities for kids to learn, and what are the ways that you as a school are strategically planning to be a school that's ready to prepare kids for their future. And so the way we were doing that was giving them that summit the day before the conference, so that before the teachers went and got all fired up, we were getting the leaders fired up about how they were going to support their schools. And some of that was through technology initiatives. So one year we had a focus, Hawaii had just started a one-to-one initiative across the state. And so our focus was, how do you leverage one-to-one in your schools? Another year, the focus for us was just about online learning and the resources that were now becoming available. So if teachers don't just have the print materials they've got in their classrooms, but if you've got, Khan Academy and Google and all of these incredible resources that are diverse and powerful, how do you leverage those, and how do you build in professional learning for your faculty so that you can use those? So we completely understand that if we give teachers all riled up and fired up about changing the world, and they go back into their schools and their structures, their school day, the expectations, if the administrator comes in and right on the board, it's Tuesday and here's your standard you're supposed to do today, then we've undermined that effort to help professionals follow that. So we spend a considerable amount of time and with our work in Leading Schools of the Future, and we do that with Kupu Academy as well. And there's other initiatives in the state. There's a Hawaii School Leaders Network that talk deeply about how to help leaders transform their practices, leadership, to support professional learning and encouraging teachers to be entrepreneurs in their classroom. So that Leading Schools of the Future work is that. This year it's going to change a little because we can't meet face-to-face. So we've redesigned it to be a series of coffee hours and invited speakers to work with school leaders as a part of our statewide conference. That's going to happen in October. So we have a strand that's specific to Leading Schools of the Future. That'll be an online piece. But we've already seen school leaders doing that, where they're just having informal coffee hours, and we've come in with that and just listen and try and understand and support what leadership needs to do to help make, in an age where we're going to have to make some serious adjustments in education, a priority for how schools are organized and how school leaders support that change. I'd like to add one more thing. I know I'm talking too much here. I have to tell you something I'm really excited about. So we have a really growing deeper learning movement in Hawaii. And so there were 6 of us knuckleheads that got together, and there was a state conference that usually happens in June was canceled, the face-to-face one. So we built a online virtual conference called Aha Kuka, which was a gathering of educators to talk about what we've learned and where we're going next. And so we spent 2 days, Ted Dintersmith, and we've been really influenced and a big believer in the work of Most Likely to Succeed and his movement with what school could be. I know Josh Rapoon, who's talked to you a bit, has talked about that. And so Ted keynoted that. And then Ian Kitajima, who's one of our futurists in Hawaii, who works with a company called Oceanit that envisions the future, spoke to educators about being educational entrepreneurs. And over those 2 days, I just want to read you, when you ask 250 teachers, what should we do? They said things like, unite community, empower kids to help each other, give students authentic opportunities to contribute to their community. We must use PBL as a bridge to our community. Projects need to be grounded in what's important to kids. Time must be set aside at the start of the school year for relationship building with students before we drive into content. This was a movement not from 1 or 2 people. This is a statewide group of educators who were making their case for how we can move education forward. And a lot of that centers on the entrepreneurship work of letting teachers innovate in their schools. So I'm really proud of that work and what happened with that.
That's awesome. We heard about that from Mickey, I'm going to say it, Casey.
She was one of our facilitators, and she's wonderful. And I think that's, so one of the things that I've learned in doing this work, and most of my work has been central to Hawaii, but I visit the mainland and work at conferences there. Their educators went into education for a reason, to make a difference in kids' lives. They're not escaping the world. They're passionate believers that they can make a difference in their classroom with kids. And I think the best cases that I've seen are when we give teachers opportunity to rise to that, they do in incredible levels, and the difference they make in kids' lives is amazing. So this community of educators is just invigorating.
Yeah. Well, we're so excited to have had you here today, because this is great. We've gone a little longer than usual, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's fantastic. We love it. Just so many good things. We're so just grateful that you've been here. But so to kind of wrap up, what is the best way that folks could get in touch with you if they wanted to learn more about what you're doing, or even plug in to some of the teachers and amazing educators that you work with?
3 or 4 places. I mean, local to me, the work we do is right at our website. It's Kupu Ho, Kupuhou, Kupu Ho, which is actually, I should have mentioned, the name is actually from the Hawaiian fern, the Kupu Kupu fern, which in barren lava fields springs up first. It's the first instance of life that happens in desolation. And so when you go across Hawaii, you see these little ferns pop up everywhere in sidewalk cracks and in lava fields. And we looked at our work with Kupu Ho as to sprout this new beginning, a way to help teachers start new ways of improving their practice. So kupuho.midpac.edu is where my work is situated, and the work we're doing both virtually and face-to-face with schools and teachers. On a larger scale, if you were to look for that movement I talked about, Many Va'a One Voyage, the Va'a is the W-A apostrophe, or it's actually Okina A. Many Va'a One Voyage is the name of the movement that led to that Aha Kuka conference and will continue to work in the States. So if someone wants to connect to that work, if you go to Many Va'a One Voyage, if you just Google that, you'll find it. The Schools of the Future conference is a third way. Go ahead.
We'll put links, because
Thank
I
you.
don't know how to spell that to save my life.
And I'm sorry. That's like, we're, language and culture is all of us in every place that we are. PBL is as much place-based learning as it is project-based learning if we do it right, because it honors place and culture and tradition and what people know in their community. So there's small differences there in the way we look at it. But then the last one is Schools of the Future Conference, because that's the statewide effort. That's a public-private charter initiative. All 3 of our school groups in Hawaii work together to learn. And so we have a hui, which in Hawaii is a gathering or a group of people who work together collaboratively. And so this hui of public, private, and charter schools has, led to this amazing work that we're all learning from each other.
Wow. Oh, it's wonderful. Oh, well, Mark, thank you. Dr. Hines, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And I know that our listeners do as well.
I'm honored to be part of the conversation. I appreciate that so much. Thank you for that.
I think my pen ran out of ink writing down all the notes from this amazing conversation.
Hawaii is definitely becoming one of our favorite states. I think you're the 3rd person at least to talk to, maybe 4th, I think, Josh. And we love what you guys are doing there. So thank you.
Please come, and we'll set up visits for you. There's a journey of learning here that is worth seeing, even without going to the beaches and the mountains.
Okay.
But thanks again. Aloha so much. I appreciate your time.
Mark. Thank you so much.